All right, welcome to chapter 5. We're going to talk about sampling, which is going to really build on last week where we talked about concepts and conceptualization, and we're going to refer back to that just a little bit, especially here at the beginning. But as we talk about building a study and what we want to study, what we want to research, we have to understand we can't research every single person in the entire world. We can't interview every single person in the world. We can't take us, send surveys to every single person in the world. We got to narrow it down, and that's all sampling is. Sampling is just narrowing it down our population. So let's say we want to study juvenile delinquents. That's our population. Well, there are a ton of juvenile delinquents, but we also have to figure out what that means. So last week we talked about concepts and conceptualization. So the concept of juvenile delinquents would is vague, and then as we conceptualize that, we would say, okay, well, I guess that means to me, anybody under the age of 18 is a juvenile. Anybody who's been arrested at least once while they're under the age of 18 is a delinquent. And so for this study, a juvenile delinquent would be somebody under the age of 18 who's currently under the age of 18 who's already been arrested and is currently out of custody. That's how I would conceptualize that, just off the top of my head. So if we think about that, how many folks and we maybe will conceptualize it even further and say, and we're only talking about the United States juvenile delinquents. So in America, people who are under the age of 18 that are not in custody but have been arrested at least once in their life, gosh, there's got to be over 1 million of those. Like a ton of folks. So there's no way, even if we had a magical list of all the people that fit that criteria, there's no way we could interview all those or send surveys to all them. Even if we, like I said, even if we had a magical Excel spreadsheet with all their names and addresses and phone numbers where we could get a hold of them, we just can't. We've got to narrow that down. And so, essentially, if we know that we want to interview, we could just pick a number and we can randomly say, I just want to interview 100 of them. And if we had that magic Excel spreadsheet with all their contact information, we could just plug that into a software and just tell the software, just randomly pick out 100 folks. And those are the ones that are going to be in our study. That would be an example of random sampling. Really easy to remember. It's called random sampling. We're just literally randomly picking out of our entire population. We're just picking out however many we want to study. So then if we know that we have a number, we're going to move on to systematic sampling. If we know we have a number, say for instance, there are only 100 people in the entire United States who fit those criteria. We just know, obviously more than 100 people have been arrested. 100 people have been arrested, but just for the sake of argument, we'll say that there are 100 people that meet these criteria. Well, we still don't want to interview. We've decided we don't want to interview all 100 of them. We only want to interview 20 of them. So systematic sampling would say, well, we're just going to pick we would literally just divide 20 into 100 and realize that comes out to 5. So we're just going to pick every 5th person systematically. That's systematic sampling. Now, stratified sampling. That's going to be where we break them down into groups, strata. So your textbook uses the example of if you wanted to study high school students and you knew that there are 4 classes, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, but not every class has the same number of students in it. Maybe your freshman class is a little bigger than your sophomore class. You would just look at the percentages and make sure your sample size achieves those percentages. I think it's a little complicated. We'll just break it into two strata. If you know you want to sample and study juvenile delinquents, and you know that 70% of your juvenile delinquents are male and 30% are female, you're just going to make sure that as you sample them, that 70% of your sample is male and 30% is female. So you could do that you could do that randomly. You can just pick, and you can plug that into the software and say there's only 100 people we're going to study, but we're 100 people in our population, but we're going to study 10 of them. Then you would randomly pick 7 males and randomly pick 3 females. That way your sample matches your strata. So those are examples of sampling when it comes to probability versus non-probability. I'm looking down at my notes here. Probability versus non-probability. So the probability are the ones that we just went over. Those are the types of sampling exercises where we give everybody an equal chance of being represented, or at least give everybody a chance to be represented. So non-probability sampling, the ones we're going to go over right now, non-probability sampling, there's a chance that somebody could get left out. Like there's a chance that they would have a 0% chance of ever being selected in this sample. So sometimes it has some scientific repercussions and scientific consequences when we say that how can we generalize this? How can we replicate this study if we had an opportunity to have somebody who could never ever be represented? So those are the dangers in non-probability sampling as opposed to the probability ones that we just examined. So before I move on to those non-probability, there's one phrase that I want to make sure that you're familiar with in your book, multi-stage sampling. That's just it comes off as a little complicated in the example, but that just means you're using more than one type of sampling, or you're using a type of sampling twice. So say we wanted to study certain neighborhoods or certain people in a town, whatever our population is. We want to study people with a record in the city of Omaha. Adults with a record in the city of Omaha. That's our population. Well, we could first pick out maybe 5 zip codes in Omaha randomly, just randomly pick out 5. So random sampling. And then we could randomly pick out certain streets in those zip codes. And then we could pick out just the brown houses and just the yellow houses and make that strata. And then we're just working down our way, just different ways to get our population narrowed down. So if you're using more than one type of sampling, then that's what we call multi-stage sampling. It sounds complicated in your book, but it just means you're using more than one kind. But then, moving on to non-probability types of sampling. The first one is called convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is just like it sounds, like just whoever you can get a hold of. A lot of folks will use the example when we talk about convenience sampling of you go to the mall and you just pick the first 100 people that you talk to and say, hey, do you meet these criteria? If you do, then let's do it. First 100 people, whoever you can get a hold of, whoever's convenient. You walk down the street, you stand at the corner of walk and don't walk, and you ask 100 people until you get the number of the sample you need. Convenience sampling, not very scientific, at least not very random. It is a scientifically sound method, but it's not very random, and you have a chance that maybe somebody wouldn't be selected. That's why it's a non-probability sample, because what if somebody just they didn't walk in that neighborhood? There's a ton of people who won't walk in that neighborhood that day, so they have a 0% chance of ever being in that study because they just didn't walk down there. So it's not random at all. Another example of non-probability sampling is to make sure that you have a list of criteria that you want to study, and you just go out of your way to make sure that you find people that meet those criteria. I'll use just a study that I think we've used an example before. Recently, we put to publish a study where we're looking at the challenges of police officers who return to school while employed as a police officer. So that's a very specific. And then we said we need to find police officers. We need to find police officers who are currently employed as a police officer. We need to make sure that they're not sheriffs or federal agents. We also need to make sure that they have, we conceptualize this. They have at least taken one class at the higher ed level. So we have these 4 criteria. We could go to, and what we did in this, we go to a certain police department and we will just say, hey, can we just talk to all the people that meet these criteria? And the first ones that we get to that meet those criteria, that volunteer to be in the study, you're there. That's an example of purposeful sampling. Purposeful sampling says that we went out of our way to find people that met these specific criteria, as opposed to convenience sampling where you just, first ones that you run into. The last one we'll talk about when it comes to this style of sampling is that sometimes people are hard to find. Sometimes it's very difficult to find a sample, like the juvenile delinquent sample. Maybe we want to study offenders. Well, if you put an ad out in the paper, first of all, that magic Excel spreadsheet that I talked about obviously doesn't exist, so we can't necessarily find every offender or have the contact information for every offender. Maybe I want to study what is the lived experience of burglars and how do they choose their houses? How do burglars choose which house they want to break into? Well, I don't have a list of every burglar. And even if I went to the jails and said, hey, let me talk to every burglar that's in the jail, who's to say that they're going to talk to me? And who's going to say that they're going to give me access to those burglars? So that's where we have a challenge. And the way we overcome that challenge is a way that we call snowball sampling. And snowball sampling just says, if you could just get one, if I could just find one person that meets those criteria, one burglar who's been arrested that will talk to me about what it's like to be a burglar and how they chose their house. And when I get the data I need from them, either through surveys or interviews, then I just say, hey, bro, do you know anybody else? Like, do you know any burglars that you can introduce me to and let them know, hey, this is an anonymous, excuse me, this is a confidential study. Their names will never be in it. And all I want to do, I'm not the, I'm not the police. I'm just a social scientist, and I'm trying to build this study. Can you introduce me to another burglar that you know? And if they say, yeah, I'll introduce you to this guy. And then he says, hey, he vouches for me, and we get the data from that guy. And I say, hey, is there anybody else you know? And then we just go down the line, and one by one, they just introduce me, and it snowballs into a bigger and bigger sample size. That's what we call snowball sampling. Sometimes a very slow process, but it's scientifically valid, but it's really great for populations that are just hard to get a hold of. Offenders is a big one. Sometimes you want to maybe you want to study police officers who have been fired for misconduct. It's going to be hard to get a hold of folks that are just going to volunteer. You put a poster up and have folks call you. They're probably not going to call you. But if you can get one, and maybe he knows somebody else, and maybe she knows somebody else, you can snowball that into a larger sample size. So that's a quick rundown of the different types of samples that we have and why we have those samples. With that being said, don't forget the assignments that are due this week, and I look forward to reading your submissions. Rock chalk.